Welcome to the sixth podcast in our series, Someone's Daughter by Rebel Justice for the VIEW Magazine. I'm Madalena Alberto, your host for this podcast. Narince Erkan, the president of our Rebel Justice Societies, spoke with Farah Nazeer, the CEO of Women's Aid. More and more intersectional feminists are shifting their focus to include women who have been victims of crime and subsequently let down by the agencies and organizations meant to help them. For too long, these women have been excluded from the feminist dialogue and battle for equal rights, so it's interesting to see how organizations like Women's Aid are taking a fresh and more inclusive approach. When we consider, according to Lord Farmer's report, that 57% of women have been victims of abuse prior to entering custody, there are important questions we need to ask to address the way that the agencies and organizations are failing these women, our women.
Okay, so firstly, can you present yourself and tell us what Women's Aid is and what do they do, a little bit about them and you?
Sure, absolutely. So Women's Aid is essentially the Women's Aid Federation of England, and we are the representative organisation of domestic abuse services across England. We represent and have our members are, if you like, 170 service providers, refuges. Some are very big and have multiple refuges, some are smaller and have one or two. We represent specialist providers, so specialist sort of by and for providers, so for black and minoritized women, disabled women and so on. We also represent specialist women's services, but generic women's services. So there are a range of different services. They're all quite different, do different things. So that gives us quite a broad view of the landscape of service provision for domestic abuse across the country. Mm-hmm. So we act as a sort of representative body. We also provide direct services to survivors of domestic abuse and those experiencing domestic abuse through our live chat service. We have a survivors forum. We provide email support to survivors. So we do a range of things to support survivors who get in touch with us directly. We have a No Women Turned Away project, so we get a direct service for survivors where we help survivors who have barriers when it comes to accessing refuge to access and find a place for them, a place of safety for them. And then we do a range of other things, so a lot of policy and advocacy and campaigning work to ensure that the landscape for domestic abuse is improved, so funding and policy and frameworks that governments and local authorities use. We also have a body of research and evaluation that happens within the organisation. And then we also do some procurement type work. So, for example, we run a Rails Refuge scheme, which means that those organisations and those charities, if you like, that are working on providing refuge to women can access free rail tickets for those women and their children to access refuge should they not have enough funds to find and to access a place of refuge. We do a range of things.
That's great. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Good work you're doing. It
might also be worth just being aware that we are 47 years old. So we were founded 47 years ago, and it's quite an interesting story the way that we were founded. Essentially, women who recognised what was called battered women at the time opened up their homes to those women and started up the first refuges, which eventually became Women's Aid. So it's a very organic story, very much an organisation led by women and driven by women for women.
Yeah. And what is kind of your background? How do you come into this, your kind of contribution? I mean, obviously, with Women's Aid, but about you as well.
Sure, absolutely. So I joined Women's Aid about 6 months ago as its Chief Executive Officer. Prior to that, I've broadly worked on women's rights my entire career. I started off working on women's human rights in Romani communities in Central and Eastern Europe prior to those countries joining the EU. And then I worked for the Women's Institute for many years on a range of women's rights issues, everything from non-custodial sentences through to trafficking, chemicals that women were more exposed to, so pensions, women's pensions, all sorts of things to do with women's rights writ quite large. And then I international development, where I've been working mainly on women's rights in the global south, so working on things like FGM, access to school, rape as a weapon of war, so a whole range of issues to do with VIEWG, violence against women and girls, in other contexts than the UK, particularly in humanitarian settings, for example, where child marriage is an issue. So lots of very similar issues to VIEWG in the UK, and lots of read across to domestic abuse. But as I said, in March I joined Women's Aid. Okay, and were you brought in, do you think, as a result of, the scandals that the Women's Aid have been involved in the last couple of years, that we've seen in the news, etc.? Do you have anything to say about that? I'm really hoping I was brought in because of my skill set and my passion for women's rights and ending VIEWG primarily. I am really concerned, and I have a passion for a range of issues, including civic space, women's environmental rights, anti-racism, and a range of issues which I've championed throughout my career. So I obviously bring a knowledge and an understanding of tackling them through those issues through organisations and ensuring organisational effectiveness against those issues. Yeah. So you obviously mentioned all the work that Women's Aid does, especially on domestic violence and abuse, and the VIEW does a lot of, trying to campaign towards domestic abuse and victims who are in the criminal justice system. And many women in the criminal justice system actually are victims of trauma and domestic abuse like this. So how do you think we can apply a more holistic approach to these individuals, or do you think we should approach them more holistically, or, Absolutely. I think we absolutely need to approach women in these contexts more holistically. When you think about the figure, 57% of women in prison report, according to the Ministry of Justice, the report having been victims of domestic abuse as adults or as children. And women in prison, the charity Women in Prison report that 79% of women who use their services have experienced domestic violence and or sexual abuse. So I think that tells the story of why women are finding themselves in the criminal justice system in the first place, and what needs to be done much earlier by way of intervention, and what intervention can be made to ensure they don't find themselves in the criminal justice system. So I think there is a more holistic, more service provision-driven response that needs to happen. Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. And you mentioned some intervention techniques and stuff. How can we make sure that these women, like you said, don't go to prison in the first place? Because most of them, it's usually very much linked to their history of abuse and trauma that they go through. How can we create a more tangible change, through legislation, through campaigning, to make sure that they don't, that is obviously linked to stopping and, decreasing domestic abuse in the first place. But what kind of intervention methods would you think should be applied to especially women in the criminal justice system? Sure. I think it's multifaceted. I think it starts off with identifying and supporting women when they are experiencing abuse in the first place. So it's I think a big part of it, which is prevention. So ensuring that women have access to specialist support services and women's refuges and safe space, so that they can find ways out of abusive relationships and abusive contexts, then they have a place to recover and recuperate and rebuild their lives. So I think that's a key part of this, in terms of ensuring those specialist services, those women's refuges are funded and are available. And when you think that something like 57% of referrals to women's refuges are rejected every year owing to lack of place, that tells a story in and of itself. What happens to those women? Where do they go? And what do they end up turning to? And what circumstances do they actually find themselves in if they cannot access safe space? So women's refuge is really critical and central to this. And there's a sort of here, if you like, so ensuring that themselves are able to understand and recognise domestic abuse and coercive control, and are able to support women through that process and refer them to services much earlier than they currently do. Because right now you have to be pretty high risk. The police think that you're about to be murdered, essentially, before you're on, which, of course, is way too late at that point. So I think there's something about that early intervention when it comes to police. Also health services, GP surgeries, all kinds of touch points that a woman might encounter. Schools need to be really aware of domestic abuse and flag it early to authorities, who then need to be prepared and able to deal with it. I think the underlying issue, though, is perhaps domestic abuse isn't taken seriously enough. Perhaps it's just tolerated in our society, and then it leads to these kinds of consequences. So I think there's a whole range of interventions that need to be prioritised and then invested in. And as part of that, attitudes have to shift and look at these women as survivors of domestic abuse first and foremost, rather than criminals in the criminal justice system.
We talked a lot about prevention and intervention before, and I kind of also want to touch on after prison, especially since our focus is women in the criminal justice system, and what happens after they leave. Because how can we improve potentially services that they are given afterwards so that they don't fall back into this cycle of abuse? That's a very hard thing to break when they're left, penniless and hopeless, and no one would employ them, etc., etc. How do we make sure that women after prison are independent enough that they do not go back to, their abusers, etc.?
I think it's absolutely critical, and I think it's the same set of services, it's the same types of services that are specialist and able to support survivors who are in prison, those on community orders, those who've just left prison. That they need access, they need a pathway to specialist support that is multifaceted and holistic. But that support absolutely has to cover off specialist refuge space, economic support, health support, and so on, depending on their circumstances, the support with children, childcare, and what support with negotiating their family circumstances. So all of that needs to be taken into account in a holistic package put around them that is trauma-informed, needs strengths-based, so that we can sort of make the best and make the most of those women's strengths, and support them to read their life and recognise the critical intervention of mental health support to enable that long-term healing and empowerment. So I think these things that need to be wrapped around them when she leaves prison, in general actually, but particularly if she's identified or disclosed domestic abuse. And I think there's also the issue of funding of specialist refuges. Not all refuges have the specialisms to support women who often have multiple needs or greater needs, who have come from prison, and unless local authorities and national government are able to fund and prioritise funding those particular services, you'll just find this cycle perpetuating. And I think the idea that these women are treated as criminals rather than women who have most likely been coerced. There are all kinds of examples from women committing offences to support partners' drug use, like shoplifting, or protecting their partner from taking responsibility for a crime to protect their partner from prosecution. There are all kinds of examples. Or male partners of domestic abuse using the criminal justice system as an additional means of exerting power against them, women being trafficked, or women having funds withheld from them, so their economic situation is so bad, whether or not they're working, that they feel forced into committing criminal activity to survive in some way, or their mental health needs not being met because they're in an abusive relationship. So I think that there are lots of different factors that drive women into the criminal justice system, and these factors can come back when they are released from prison, or or even whilst they're in prison. So it is about wrapping that holistic set of services around them
Yes, I agree again. I mean, I also kind of want to ask about how have women's aid specifically recognized that this prevalence of women in the criminal justice system who have endured domestic abuse. Do you offer any specialist approaches, etc.? I mean, we talk a lot about these stuff, but is there anything special that you guys offer as women's aid to these women who are in prison or leave prison or are convicted, etc.?
Sure, absolutely. So we run a No Women Turned Away project, and that supports women who face barriers to accessing refuge due to criminal convictions and other reasons, but criminal conviction is part of this project. And of all the women that we've supported with those additional barriers to accessing refuge, 8% of them had an offending history. So we encourage our members and indeed all providers to refer women to our project when they feel that they have those additional barriers, so we can work with the women and with the services to find them the right place to support them. So that's a key part of our offering. We feel very strongly that no woman should ever be turned away from refuge, and this is exactly what this project is set up to do.
Just kind of breaking away, but also not from that. I was just going to ask you kind of what your views on in sending these women to prison in the first place.
Sure. I don't know if it's helpful at all, but just in terms of some of, just go back to the other things that we're really keen to flag, because we want these services to be used more. We want to support more women who have an offending history or who've just been released or who are currently in prison to access these services. And many of our member services provide specialist support specifically for women involved in the criminal justice system. So, for example, I don't know if you heard of Advance's Minerva Wraparound Service, and that's a particular service which provides support to women and girls, I think it's at age 15 or over, who have those multiple and complex needs, who have committed a crime and at risk of reoffending. And we have many members that do this and prioritise this. And indeed, when we ran the national hotline, we had a particular element of that specifically for women in prison to make it a free phone number. So we are trying to ensure that we provide our services and tailor our services to women who've been caught up in the criminal justice system.
I mean, my next question was about, how can women's aid be more inclusive and create change for these women in the criminal justice system? I think you kind of answered that, but, to make it even more inclusive, would you have any specific aims or, to make it even more approachable and make your services known to perhaps women in prison or out of prison because maybe they are not aware, etc.? Kind of your plans on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think maybe just taking it from the top up, sort of from the sort of national framework, legislative framework, something that we will continue to campaign on is for a statutory defence where offending is driven by abuse. So that was rejected in the domestic abuse bill, unfortunately, and we did campaign alongside the Centre for Women's Justice and Prison Reform Trust on amendment, and it was rejected, unfortunately, but it is something that we will continue to work on because we very much see we very much believe that needs to be absolutely taken into account where a defence is offending driven by domestic abuse. We'll carry on campaigning on that. The other piece that we're very keen to get across again nationally is to protest and defend against the idea of 500 new prison places for women, because those funds are far better invested in services for women, either for when they're out of prison to stop them entering the criminal justice system in the first place. That just sort of perpetuates the current system rather than the examining and changing the current system. So I think we will absolutely be calling for changes to the system itself, because that's sort of where it starts, if you like. When it comes to our own services, we do share them and advertise them to all of the referral points that we feel that women would touch, and perhaps there's more, perhaps there is more that we could do, but we currently do share it with all of the organisations that are involved. But I'd really encourage if there are any organisations that feel that they're not in partnership with us on this, particularly the No Women Turned Away project, absolutely approach us, and we'll be really happy to work with anybody on sharing any services, because the idea is to absolutely fundamentally get them to survivors.
Yeah. And just to end on a more broad, maybe just general question for you is, what are your visions for Women's Aid in the future? What would you like to achieve with the organisation?
Sure, absolutely. I think currently domestic abuse everyone knows about it, but it's kind of broadly acceptable in our society. I think what we need to do is move from making it acceptable to making it utterly unacceptable. And what I guess my absolute vision is for Women's Aid to change the context and cultural awareness around domestic abuse and make what was broadly acceptable completely intolerable. That's sort of my first ambition, because I don't think anything else will really follow until we have a shared understanding. I don't think enough will follow for survivors until society itself shifts its approach to domestic abuse. And I'm absolutely passionate about ensuring that every single survivor gets the services that she needs, and that those are fully funded and sustainable. So that's like the second piece. And then I guess the third piece for me is that every single touch point that a survivor might encounter is absolutely geared and able to identify abuse and respond to it.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you so much for that. That was very, very interesting.
Thank you so much, Narince Erkan and Farah Nazeer, for this insightful and important discussion. If you've been affected by the issues discussed in this podcast, please reach out. You are not alone. You can contact any of the helpline numbers below. Thanks to our brilliant team, Holly McVie, producer and editor, and to you for listening. Stay tuned for next week's episode on the Irish justice system and how it treats women, with Ivana Bacik, a senator in the Irish Senate, and Farah Damji, one of the founders of The View. Until next time.